I will present a summary of the alternative policy, and our summary will also consider some aspects of the budget estimates. It should be recalled that the Constitution bestows foreign relations and external trade as a responsibility and mandate of the government, and the same Constitution operationalizes and provides for national objectives and directive principles of state policy. Specifically, the government is mandated to ground Uganda's foreign policy on principles of promotion of national interest for the country, respect for international law and treaty obligations, peaceful coexistence and non-alignment, settlement of international disputes by peaceful means, and opposition to all forms of domination, racism, and other forms of oppression and exploitation. Unfortunately, the sector of foreign affairs lacks a laid-down foreign policy to guide the country's international relations. Equally, the executive has not reviewed mission charters since 2014. Key policy, legal, and regulatory mechanisms as laid down in the NDP 3 have not materialized halfway into the term of the plan. Currently, Uganda's undocumented foreign policy is staggered in uncoordinated and unprioritized planning. Madam Chair, I was reading out this introduction or preamble because it forms a basis of why we think we need to lay and present these alternatives. Madam Chair and members, as opposition, our intent is to streamline labor externalization by urgently negotiating and implementing bilateral labor agreements or labor agreements. This is housed on the background that Ugandan nationals who would be key beneficiaries of our foreign relations, especially where Uganda wishes and negotiates bilateral agreements, such agreements must be enforceable. It's on record that Uganda has negotiated in some instances agreements and even at some stages signed agreements, but they have not enforced the same. A case in point has remained UAE as a leading example. Developing a foreign policy for Uganda and Mission Charter, we believe lack of a codified foreign policy affects the foreign missions and equally the foreign ministry, even in the appropriation process. Many times it becomes hard to justify a number of allocations and budget proposals. And that's why several times the ministry and missions come here requesting for additional funding. We only need to look for the missing gap, especially the policy missing gap. And also developing mission charters. We need to interrogate where there ought to be funding so that we can demand results. Developing a policy on diaspora engagement. We understand our foreign missions undertake, and some, if not majority, receive funding for diaspora engagements. And then there are those which would qualify to actually undertake diaspora engagement, but they are not funded. Part of the challenge is lack of policy. As opposition, we cannot even tell what does it entail to engage the diaspora. But we have laid down our own perception on diaspora engagement, especially under ECD. Review and enhance funding towards the sub-program of enhancement of commercial and economic diplomacy. Economic diplomacy benefits us as a country and also benefits individual traders, but also builds our international engagements. We have not seen enhanced funding on a number of priority areas in several instances. We want also to prioritize on domesticating key conventions and protocols. This committee has been handling a number of proposals to urge government to sign, ratify, and probably domesticate conventions. The Minister of Foreign Affairs and Missions would have known this and would have undertaken this all the way if we had better planned for domestication and execution or implementation of these conventions and protocols. We cannot handle them in piecemeal and succeed. We must have a robust approach where key conventions and protocols are followed up and legally executed wherever necessary. Undertake acquisition of mission property. It's on the record that a number of missions are renting, and some with permanent structures have been crying out for refurbishing and reconstruction of the same. We believe in the budgetary process. We must have an open approach on mission properties so that this anomaly is rectified once and for all. And lastly, our priorities as opposition is enabling Ugandans in the diaspora to engage in the democratic processes of the country, including voting. We have been making a case for national ID registration, enabling diaspora to register, passport acquisition, enabling Ugandans in the diaspora to acquire, renew, and replace Uganda passports. But we believe when this is achieved, the ministry announced a phased program of installing digital machines in various missions. Much as that is still wanting, but we cannot end at empowering the diaspora only with travel documents, minus the rights that accompany travel and national documents. Madam Chair and members, that forms a basic summary of our priorities. And to mention, Madam Chair, when you look at the estimates, to buttress a number of these priorities, we have looked at the ministerial policy statement, where the headquarters was approximately budgeted for 30.203 billion. I'm looking at 2024-2025, from the ministerial policy statements, and the missions budget appropriated at 266.365 billions. That's a total of 296.568 in estimates. And looking at the budget estimates, the headquarters has been lowered down to 28.589 billion, and the missions put at 266.465 billion. Madam Chair and members, as opposition, our approach to appropriation and in consideration of the budget estimates vis-a-vis the ministerial policy statement, we believe there are some key deliverables in the foreign affairs sector that have been underlooked, partly because of the reasons I've enumerated, that we don't have a codified foreign policy. The mission charters have not been reviewed. There is a lot that the Ministry of Finance and government has failed to understand and appreciate in the sector of foreign affairs and operations of the missions and the foreign ministry. Unfortunately, the consequence has been felt by Ugandans in the diaspora. We are proposing, Chair, I'm giving a summary of what we have tabulated in our detailed we have opposition allocation on page 19. On page 19 of the alternative policy. Madam Chair and colleagues, just to buttress this recommendation, the NDP3 sets out objectives and strategic interventions targeted at enhancing the image of Uganda abroad and attracting inbound investment and tourism, as well as identifying a market for Ugandan products. However, to date, the sector lacks a laid-down national foreign policy to guide our international relations. Of course, this is in the context of Parliament, because Parliament has since directed and the ministry had committed on behalf of government. When you look at provision of diplomatic and protocol or consular services, these services and its provision abroad are very inadequate. There is lack of capacity. And this lack of capacity to offer consular services for distressed Ugandans abroad, especially in the Middle East, has caused us dire consequences, including sufferings. Many times we are in Parliament demanding for government intervention, and the answer from the missions has been, we don't have a budget. The recent scenario is our demand to rescue Ugandans stranded in Myanmar. And a mission came requesting for 100 million, approximately 100 million, just to conduct its mandated program, visiting Myanmar, Bama, to execute its own role. Now, this speaks to lack of funding. We cannot handle challenges of Ugandans in the diaspora by piecemeal. We must arrest the budgeting process and recommend for appropriate and adequate funding for these missions and the ministry in line with the clear laid down policy and strategy. When you look at the thousands who are stranded in the Gulf region, especially in Saudi and in the Middle East, we don't have enforceable bilateral agreements. We need to budget and empower the missions to negotiate, enter, execute bilateral labor agreements. But more importantly, Madam Chair, this committee must explore enforcement, supporting enforcement of these bilateral labor agreements. Because the case study of UAE, part of the challenge that has been reported, these agreements are signed, but to enforce them requires a budget. So we must, from the onset, plan and budget for enforceable bilateral agreements than just signing as mere documents. When you look at our passport index and why we are proposing that a lot of intervention in the budgetary process must be explored, Uganda's passport ranking is so low. Madam Chair, as we speak now, we have countries which have visa-free entry into Uganda, but we don't have a reciprocal arrangement. And this speaks to unfairness. We must trade at a win-win level. Other nationalities can enter Uganda, but we cannot enter their country. And the recent challenge is the one between Uganda and DRC, where Uganda removed all of visa restrictions, for example, but to enter DRC still you have to pay and have to process a visa prior for our Ugandan nationals. We need to explore the remaining challenges in this budgetary process. And that's why we are saying let's prioritize and recommend funding so that we bridge all these gaps. Adherence to regional international laws and commitments. You are aware, Madam Chair, that Uganda has failed in its compliance to meet international obligations, failing to pay international subscription, including failing to pay for the African Union is a bit shaming for regional integration and international cooperation. So we believe we must look at this sector keenly and recommend the appropriate funding that will boost our compliance with regional and international laws and commitments. Poorly coordinated economic and commercial diplomacy. There is limited implementation of economic and commercial diplomacy. ECD aims at generating commercial gains in the form of trade, inward and outward investment between Uganda and the countries with which we have mutual and diplomatic relations. From our counting, basing on 2023-2024, approximately 5 out of 38 missions or votes were allocated funding for economic and commercial diplomacy. And ECD, whereas ECD is listed as an objective, there is no corresponding funds allocated for the same. Every time we receive ministerial policy statements, they list ECD. How come there is no corresponding funding? And this has denied Ugandans fair market and fair trade, but as well empowering our nationals to engage in international trade. We cannot just document and hear trade in terms of figures and news, whereas we can engage and effectively fund where necessary these missions and the relevant votes to undertake ECD and effective service delivery. Of course, here we are prioritizing on mission properties. These embassies, wherever they are, ought to have a sense of comfort in their operations. But we have had some missions allaying fears that they might be displaced. There are some which are affected by compliance issues. A case in point is Cairo, where the capital was shifted, has a requirement of the host country that the embassy has to be shifted. So we must plan for these missions and mission property. That will be strengthening these institutions for service delivery. Madam Chair and colleagues, just to expound on our funding priorities, labor externalization. We believe labor externalization is a critical sector, but negotiating and seeking for funding only to cater for the distressed is not actually a solution in a budgetary process. In a budgetary process, we must look to bridge the gaps that causes the challenges in labor externalization. We have discussed quite and again the need, first of all, to bring into legal perspective the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. It is challenging that the Ministry of Gender, which lacks diplomatic presence in countries of the world, is the primary sector in labor externalization. And many times, the ministry's role, which is actually present on ground, is affected by the lacuna within the law. We need to address this with all the urge it may require, including the relevant budget and budgetary planning. Because in international law, it is our missions and diplomats who have the physical presence in those countries. Even when we have complaints of Ugandans stranded, distressed, and challenges, our first remedy is to seek answers from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the embassies. Their consistent answer has been, we don't have the funds. Madam Chair and the colleagues, we are in a budgetary process. Let's look for the funds. Let's recommend for the right funding so that these missions are empowered to actually undertake whatever is needed to support Uganda nationals. It is a priority for any embassy and any government that whenever they have a mission abroad, their primary clients would be the Ugandans or their nationals in those countries. We need to buttress this. And when it comes to also labor externalization, even where we have negotiated bilateral agreements, we need to explore the necessary funding to operationalize those relevant bilateral labor agreements. But as well, because we already have Ugandans in the Middle East, and in so many other countries of the world who are already distressed, stranded, and challenged by one reason or the other. It serves good purpose if we recommend specific funding to cater for those already in distress, as was done in previous budgets, especially the 2020 or 2021 budget, where they allocated around 5 billion for the runaway girls and distressed Ugandans. Madam Chair and colleagues, we talked about developing foreign policy and mission charters. I don't need to expound more on this, but what is critical, we have been insisting that the ministry tables a codified foreign policy. We want to put it on record that it will be hard and consistently hard for this committee and parliament to justify funding for the foreign affairs sector unless we insist on the foreign policy, because it gives you the legal mandate within which to make the argument for the appropriate funding to execute those tasks. Now we are aligning these facts housed under the Constitution and other enabling laws and out of need. But without the legal framework, there is that cover the Ministry of Finance and government is using to deny funding. And even when you go to the program-based budgeting, many of our missions have been given programs that underrate their performance. And whereas they would have performed better, but they are put under program heads, which actually deny them the chance to get the relevant funding. And if you could recall, when Parliament was processing the budget framework paper, indeed one of the challenges was a budget presented in terms of sectors, whereas government uses now a program-based budgeting. And it was a commitment by Minister of Finance that they will realign the budget in the program, the budget later towards programs, and this would definitely deny. You will find a number of sectors being denied the funding, whereas they would have got funding, and that's why you must insist on codification of foreign policy and interrogate any need for funding and also development of these mission charters. Then, Madam Chair, on diaspora engagement, we are insisting as opposition that there must be a development of a diaspora engagement policy. As opposition, we have a fear. Uganda is in the diaspora, and indeed, wherever you have been doing oversight reports, some embassies have been saying Ugandans don't come to the embassies. They don't use them, and that is true. But part of the reason is that Ugandans in the diaspora have different values, and they belong to different political groupings, to mention the list. Now, there is a perception that diaspora engagement is mobilizing Ugandans towards NRM or government, whereas diaspora engagement would only mean different if it will qualify for national funding. It must be for national development, among others. Now, the lack of a diaspora engagement policy speaks to this lacuna. If we are to mobilize Ugandans, they must know they are mobilized under what arrangement and for what. We want to look at areas like economic and commercial diplomacy, among others. And that's why we are saying there's need to prioritize and recommend funding for development of a diaspora engagement policy, so that every Ugandan can know that if there is diaspora engagement and mobilization are mobilized for this and this and this, not actually biased political angles. As I conclude, Madam Chair, we are also talking about enhancement of commercial and economic diplomacy. Of course, Ugandans and Ugandan traders have been affected because we can't know, and we don't have the necessary resource. The embassies have not been empowered. The ministry has not been empowered. And many times when you look at the previous budget, only 5, according to our counting, missions or votes were given support or funding for ECD. Chair, this is a tragedy. Uganda cannot trade with only 5 countries. Uganda must trade with the countries of the world based on their potential. And this speaks to our role as a committee to recommend that ECD funding should be reinstated for most of these missions. I heard that some missions got this reinstatement just in supplementary. We must plan for ECD and plan strategically. Madam Chair, I already talked about domesticating key conventions and protocols. I want to repeat that. And acquisition of mission properties. We have presented a table a table of an inventory of properties abroad. But the principle behind this is that where possible, let's acquire, and where possible, let's develop or improve or refurnish our existing structures. And as well, this requires planning. It cannot be abrupt. It will be a shame for our missions to fail to provide the relevant services just because they are uncomfortable in office or wherever they are situated. So we have laid a table of the various missions where we think we can prioritize. And then we have also laid a table of missions without properties on page 17, or missions without properties at all, where we think there must be a multi-layer approach on turning, for example, rent advances or installments on property acquisition, much as we are left to the Public Finance Management Act. But we believe when a mission, for example, for some missions which receive rent, if this rent is remitted back to the Ministry of Finance, it should be so simple for these missions to request for this funding. It should be prioritized on improving the foreign service sector, so that and that will speak to the budget. Lastly, Madam Chair, is on enabling Ugandans to vote. This is still we have been making the case for Ugandans to be registered for national IDs and to receive passports so that they can live as citizens of Uganda wherever they are. But, and indeed, the ministry and government has since commenced the phased installation of digital machines to ease acquisition of and renewal of passports for some areas. We believe this exercise must be supported to reach all missions. And as well, we believe that Ugandans acquiring passports and national IDs is not enough. They must exercise their full rights as citizens. So where it speaks to the budget, we recommend that there should be appropriate funding for such. And then lastly, Madam Chair, as a rejoinder, is to do with establishment of these missions. We believe that some missions are no longer tenable in terms of their areas of coverage. And this will also speak to funding. For example, Uganda's mission in Russia was designated as equally the mission that covers Ukraine. And these are countries at war. In this budgetary process, let's prioritize and either attach Ukraine to another vote or mission, or we recommend a creation of a consulate or an embassy specifically for Ukraine and those other countries. Otherwise, these are countries at war. An ambassador cannot purport to represent Uganda in Russia and represent Uganda in Ukraine. These host countries won't receive them. It's on record that there are some of our ambassadors who have not yet been received or accredited, much as they were posted. And this speaks to the nature, the way we select when and how to send and the coverage of these missions. And two, also, we are recommending creation of missions or consulates in areas where we have mass populations or a high population of Ugandans. We have regions which have high population of Ugandans, but they have not been supported and they have no access to consular services. I'll mention a case for Turkey. Majority of Ugandans in Turkey are within Istanbul. The embassy is in Ankara. It is hard. Boarding a plane from Istanbul to Ankara is another cost like boarding from Uganda to Turkey. And these are Ugandans who are largely low-income earners. We must recommend for appropriate funding to put consulates where necessary and as well embassies where necessary to support our Uganda nationals wherever they are. Madam Chair and colleagues, in the interest of time, I beg to submit our alternative policy statement in addition to all our previous contribution within the committee sitting. I beg to submit.